Afternoon, everybody. I have 2 o'clock, and so we're going to go ahead and get started this afternoon. I hope all of you are in a safe and dry place. We have some storms going on around here, so I'm hoping my internet is going to hold out as I host you today. If I disappear, I've got backup at the foundation office to be with us to pick up the slack. I'm glad you could join us for the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana's Grant Writing for Churches webinar. I'm Deborah Davis, and I chair the Foundation Grants Committee, and I'm a member of the Executive Board, and I'll be your host for this afternoon. I'd like to begin this afternoon by introducing you to our speaker, Britney Winn Lee. Britney is a writer and an editor and a nonprofit professional and soon to be seminarian. And she lives here in our own state. Britney is in Shreveport. You can learn more about Britney on her blog at BritneyWinnLee.com. Britney, thank you for being here with us today. We're delighted that you could join us for this very important topic. Before we get started, though, I'd like to invite anybody to feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat during the presentation today. And we're going to be posting some resources on our website after the meeting today, including Britney's PowerPoint presentation and the recording of this meeting. So if you missed something, we'll have a recording that you can go back and review. Kelly is going to keep our microphones muted. We are expecting somewhere near 70 people on this webinar today. You can, if you're comfortable and you want to turn on your camera, that's fine. We don't mind that. If you start having some problems with bandwidth and connectivity, you may need to just shut your video down and just have the audio on. Around 3 o'clock, we're going to take about a 7-minute break. So if you can hold off until 3 o'clock, we'll take that quick break, and then we'll come back and finish up the last hour of this webinar. So Britney, if you're ready, we will hand this over to you.
I am. Hey, everybody. Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. In just a second, I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can have a presentation, a loose presentation to guide us this afternoon. My name is Britney Winn Lee. I'm honored to be with you to talk about grant writing today. I've had the immense privilege of working in a variety of ways over the last few years. Typically, my connection has been as a liturgist for annual conference or events like the upcoming clergy retreat, which if any of you are going to attend, I'll see you there. However, I'm thrilled to be getting to use a different muscle today by sharing with you some experience and insight in the world of grant writing. Since graduating college at Centenary, I've had opportunities over the last 12 years to facilitate grant programs from the vantage point of the organization processing applications and award proposals, as well as apply for grant operating funds as a director of both church and nonprofit work. In addition, I've applied for and received personal writing grants to fund book and research projects, including grants powered by the Lilly Foundation at both Collegeville and Louisville Institutes. This past March, I received my master's of nonprofit administration through Louisiana State University in Shreveport, which provided a comprehensive understanding of grant writing, funding ethics, accounting and reporting, and legality, among other areas in the field. And I will hopefully be pairing that with a deacon track as I pursue candidacy. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that we can get started. How's that? We seeing everything? Okay. All right, I promise not to try and condense master's program into our 2-hour seminar today. Instead, with my church experience in tow, I've synthesized some of the information and resources that I think are most pertinent for clergy and lay leaders in our conference at this time. So as we get started, I want to invite you to take a second to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, what community and or church you're a part of, and we'll go ahead and begin. To begin, let's take a brief look at what you can expect from our time together today. In this first hour, we'll be focusing on the reasoning for grants, establishing need and intent, and identifying grant opportunities. After that, we'll take a short break around the hour mark before coming back to discuss proposals and narratives, data systems, budgets, ethics, and reporting. What I hope you'll leave here with today is a less theoretical and more practical understanding of grant writing, some resources for what grants are available right now to you, concrete ideas for your next steps, and connections among the group and the foundation for ideas of how to collaborate. Are there, as we get started, any questions about the outline of our time together? I'll depend on Deborah to let me know since I do not see the chat with my screen share. All right, ready to roll? Okay. Abraham Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew." I do not have to tell most of you here that we are in uncomfortable financial times as individuals, as a country, and as the church at large. Speaking to church finances specifically, on top of the Pew Research Center's report before the pandemic in 2019, that 65% of Americans do not currently attend church, adding to the conversation of what some are calling a mass exodus from organized religion, we are also faced with the challenges of COVID, and for some, especially in our state, hurricane upheaval. In their article, 8 Financial Lessons for the Post-Pandemic Church, writers Levitt Weems and Ann Mitchell from the Lewis Center for Church Leadership shared that in the aftershocks of COVID-19 crisis, many following 8 principles can help right the ship. They are all sound practices in the best of times, but are even more critical now as the church navigates uncharted territory in post-pandemic America. These 8 lessons include, and I did not put them on a slide, but you'll have them to you later simply because we're not focusing on all of them today, but I did want you to hear them. They include knowing your givers, continuing to ask people to give while doing so in sensitive ways, extending generosity efforts beyond the walls of the church, developing multiple streams of income, taking the opportunity to reassess expenses, being realistic when setting your budget, maintaining a reserve fund, and knowing where you stand regarding your mission. These, of course, can all be applied to areas of our home and outside of the church. But for the purposes of this webinar, we are focusing today on the 4th lesson, which was developing multiple streams of income or diversifying our finances. Weems and Mitchell write, in the post-pandemic era, many more churches will find it necessary to develop funding sources on tithes and offerings. Churches often see their financial circumstances through the lens of scarcity, failing to recognize assets and opportunities within their grasp. A more holistic approach to economic sustainability can involve greater creativity in deploying physical assets, seeking new partners and sources of support, and embracing more efficient ways of sustaining the mission. So maybe this means reimagining and repurposing our actual physical spaces and buildings. There's a lot of conversation happening about that right now. Maybe this means taking notes from some of the things we learned when we had to be virtual in order to better share the load or slough off what's not really serving us anymore. Maybe this means assessing our programs and vision with our leadership and finance teams in order to see what types of grant opportunities are out there just waiting on communities and ideas like ours to support. So typically when people think grants, they think nonprofit organizations that qualify for 501c3 status. They do not always realize that churches are automatically recognized as 501c3 charitable organizations by the IRS. And they do not always realize that there are grants available as well to individuals outside of or in conjunction with 501c3 status organizations. So let me give you a couple of examples from personal experience. On the church 501c3 status side of things, I worked for 5 years as the director of Knoll Community Arts Program, which was a mission outreach of Knoll Memorial UMC in Shreveport. Knoll Community Arts Program is currently working toward establishing its own 501c3 status outside of the church in order to expand its opportunities for fundraising and programming efforts. But for its first 12 years, it functioned under the umbrella of the church's 501c3. And for years now has run the outreach side of its art and music lessons in the neighborhood through a consistently awarded foundation grant. Now, would this particular foundation be willing to award money to Knoll as a church as a whole to keep the lights on during a low donation season or during pandemic stress? I'm not sure, but I would think that it's unlikely. However, Knoll was able to identify one niche area of ministry that honed in on the arts, as well as the local under-resourced neighborhood that it's a part of, in order to qualify for those dollars, thereby freeing up other funding within the church to run operations. So as you're considering your personal experiences in the context where you are in and that you're serving, it would be one thing to think about how to sustain your operating funds, but if you can start piecing apart the different programs in your area to see maybe what your church or a community offers as a niche program that could appeal to grant writers, that would be a first step. I keep forgetting which screen I'm on. Now, on an individual level, 3 years ago, I set out to compile a call and response liturgy book for people interested. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself with my screens. Let's go back. I set out to compile a call and response liturgy book for people interested in content that fell at the intersection of faith and justice. On account of my limited experience, I knew that to do right by the topics that would be in the book, I would need to contain voices from multiple marginalized areas of society. And by nature of the ethics surrounding fair pay for fair work, especially when requesting contributions from marginalized writers, I knew that there would need to be a funding source in order to offer compensation. And funding source I could not personally provide, for which I might be able to write it. So knowing my dilemma, a friend of mine told me about a grant opportunity called the Louisville Institute's Pastoral Project Grant. Now, this is one of the grants that I have written down in a list that I've sent to Deborah and Kelly that will be pushed out to all of you after this webinar. It is a fantastic grant provided by the Louisville Institute, powered by the Lilly Foundation, which awarded up to $15,000 for pastors or ministry leaders. I'm not clergy, but I'm still qualified, who are engaged in projects that are adding to the conversation of a changing church. And though I was a lay leader who was applying as an individual, the grant was set up in such a way while it asked for information about my affiliated faith community, and it wanted to know with whom I was planted and where I would be getting support on a local level, it did not require funding to funnel through a 501c3. So there really is a spectrum out there of where funding can come from and what they expect. These are just two very specific examples of countless opportunities out there for your organization or personal projects alike. The folks at fundingforgood.org share, there are many foundations that exist specifically to advance the mission of specific churches, denominations, religious beliefs, schools of theology, sabbaticals for clergy, and faith-based nonprofits. How can you locate these funds? This type of research is the same as all the rest. You just have to know where to look. There are funds for building, renovation, education, programs, projects, and guide. One specific example is it's called the Duke Endowment. One of their priority areas is specified to rural Methodist churches in the North Carolina area. And that is a super specific type of funding that they provide for that region. So don't assume that you can always find funding for your church need. As with all churches and grants, the organizational needs and the foundation priorities must match before success can happen. Initially, all grant research involves realistically determining your research criteria, your needs, your area of impact, your area of service. I'm going to repeat those in case I'm going a little fast. Your research should be determined by your needs, your area of impact, and your area of service. Then you begin searching for the foundations or the private organizations that want to support those specific things, which brings us to intent. It would be a mistake to run headfirst into a grant opportunity simply because you've heard there are funds available and because you are seeing more red than black in your organization's accounts. Developing and I should say that, and maybe Kelly and Deborah can speak to this, foundations can tell if you've done that as well with your applications. If you have run headfirst into it just because you know that there is money available without actually assessing your intent and capabilities. So developing a clear picture for exactly what will be accomplished with the grant money is truly the first step. And here's some questions that can help you as individuals, groups, or churches develop a clear picture from the get-go. And these are taken from a book called Managing a Nonprofit by John Riddle. And they are, is this project necessary? We have so many projects out there, so many nonprofits out there. One of the things that it pains me to hear is when someone is writing for a grant or raising money for a very specific goal that is already underway. They just didn't do their research to see if it was underway in their area and to see if collaboration was a possibility. So is this project necessary means, is it needed? And is it needed by me in this very specific way? Or am I just reinventing the wheel with different funding? How am I, or how is our organization uniquely qualified to meet this need? So I mentioned that I worked with Knoll Community Arts Program. We were not the only arts program in the Highland neighborhood of Shreveport, but we had a very unique approach compared to the other arts program that we shared space with and were committed to collaborating with. So that's a question of what is your unique offering for this need in this very specific place. What specific objective do I or we want to accomplish? And that can be long-term or short-term, and probably should be. How will I or we know whether we have achieved those goals? These goals need to be measurable. And measurable does not necessarily mean tedious and hard, but we do have to have some sort of structure to measure what those goals are. And your grantors will want to know that you are thinking about that and considering it and have a plan in place. What group or groups of people will be served? How will those people benefit from this program? And I will say that in my experience, groups, plural of people, is much more than just one specific group. If you can, with what you are offering, serve multiple groups of people and have some overlap, then all the better. How will I or we let them know that our program is available? How will we get the word out? How will I or we spend each dime of the grant money exactly? And we'll get a little bit into that later when we talk about ethics. Who will be in charge of the project and budget? We can't just ask for money and put it in an account and hope for the best over the next year. There will be a reporting period, more than likely, and you don't want to get 12 months down the road and realize that someone had not spearheaded the project that you had been awarded money for. Who will assist that person if that person needs assistance? Does someone need to be hired to carry out this work? When will it start? When will the project end, or will it continue indefinitely? And what systems for recording and reporting numbers and narratives will we use? And this can be high dollar software that you invest in, or it can be a Google Doc. Whatever it is, knowing your system is important. Once this framework is established and addressed, your funding source research will be equipped with the necessary information for finding the best match for your project. It will require you to outline much of this information, and you'll have already had it gathered. So you will have done the work on the front end. It'll all be completed, and for the most part, what the information you will need for most grant applications will be there right in front of you for you to plug in. Do we want to pause and see if there are any questions about what we've shared so far?
Sure. Does anyone have any questions for Britney? If you do, you can just unmute your mic and ask them, or if you prefer, you can type them in the chat.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
If you hire somebody, do you need to indicate in the proposal how much you're going to pay that person salary?
Only if you are writing, and Deborah Kelly, please share your experience as well. From what I have experienced, you only need to write that in if it is going to be accounted for in the grant. So if you might want to put the information of who you're hiring, just so that they know that somebody is going to be over this project, and they know that that is a piece of the puzzle, that is an extra step you're going to take. But you don't have to get specific with funding unless you are asking for funding for that specific piece from that specific grant.
Does that answer your question? Okay, any other questions for Brittany before we move on? Okay, Brittany, sounds like we're good.
All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how to identify funding agencies. And this is the big question that most people have. How do I find the grants? I keep being told that there are grants out there. Why don't you apply for a grant? Why don't you just write a grant? How do I find them? So I only have 3 answers for this. I only have utilized 3 different ways of going about this. And the first is at your fingertips. It is Google. I cannot even imagine a time of grant writing when Google was not a thing. A simple Google search such as United Methodist Grants, and I did that for in preparation for this webinar, will offer your applicable results such as website development grants, if your church does not have a website, and you also don't have the extra cushion funding to prioritize that tech. There are grants out there for that. Or Peace with Justice Project grants, or confidential clergy counseling grants. That's a part of our conference right now. Most funding opportunities will be clear and explicit in both their title and explanation of what they're supporting, who qualifies, and when an application is due. These are the main things to identify first. For our specific conference, for the Methodist Foundation, for the conference office, for our Fresh Expressions area of our conference, all of these can be found with a simple Google search or going to the websites for these areas. They're all outlined. They're very easy to navigate to find out who it pertains to, who qualifies, and what you will have to do to qualify or to what qualifies you to be able to send in an application. The second, so the first is Google, always Google. The second is contact your local foundations, whether that's the Methodist Foundation, a private family foundation, or your regional community foundation. Reach out to see what types of grants they are currently awarding and whether or not you qualify as an organization or an individual. Most areas, most regions have a community foundation, and they have a grant calendar. They have cycles. Some of them are once a year, some of them are twice a year, some of them are ongoing. And reaching out to them to get a list of those opportunities is one way to go about it. And then, of course, reaching out to our Methodist Foundation is an option as well. And the third, so Google, Foundation asks, and ask for new leads. Do not hesitate to ask any of the above contacts through phone or email or in person what other opportunities are out there that they are familiar with that may suit your needs at this time. No one is in the world of grants or aware of other funding sources like they are. And most of the time, if you are not a good match for their dollars, they point you in the direction of a better match who is. Or if you have already utilized that specific grant from that specific organization and you do not qualify for another grant from them, or you cannot qualify for an annual grant for them, but you need continuing funds, they will be able to tell you who has funds out there that might be a good match for yours. I have done this several times with different grants. I've reached out to the foundations or the institutes that have previously awarded me or my organization, but we aren't on their, it's not available to us again for another couple of years. So I'll reach out and say, great, can you point me in the direction of a few contacts that are, and that is a fantastic way to get new leads from people who are in that world more saturated and more constantly than you or I have to be in on a normal basis. So once you have the grant application or application selected And typically these are all online now. Some of them are still paper format, and it'll require you to print out and fill out and mail in. If that is the case, you want to make sure that it is in the mail and able to arrive by the cutoff date. Our mail has been unpredictable. If you can hand deliver, that's a great thing as well. But if you can't, make sure you're ahead of the game with that. But most often than not, it's going to be online, and you'll be able to, it'll say, here's the title, here's the description, here's the date, and here's the button for the application. So once you have the application selected, it's time to study the requirements and make a punch list of what you'll need and from whom. Typically, this will be, I usually do this in Excel or a Word document, something that I can add checks to, add check-offs, check marks. This will be things like, what's your timeline? What's your itemized budget or projected budget? What are the biographies, the qualifications of the person who will be directing this project or managing the funds? What are testimonies from people who have indicated that they need a project like yours or are already benefiting from a project like yours if it's already underway? What are some stories that you can collect? And if this is an already established program, what are the stats that correlate with who has already been served? And those are things like how often and in what ways, how many people. If it's not already an established program, these numbers will often need to just be projected. We anticipate serving this many people this many times in these many ways. So I want to go over those one more time, just because it's a lot to chew on. When you have your application selected, it's time to make your punch list, which are things like, what's your timeline? What's your itemized budget? Bio and qualifications of people directing the project and managing the funds, testimonies and stories, and stats correlating with who's been served, whether that is who's already been served or projected stats for who you anticipate to be served. All right. Let's put a little note in here about creating budgets. When Kelly and Deborah and I talked yesterday, we talked about the importance of budgets, and they both mentioned that it would be good to follow up with this webinar with some more tools like budget templates and things like that. So you can be on the lookout for that. Deborah, did you want to say anything about that?
I will do that when we come back from the break, Brittany.
Oh, great. Okay. So we'll put a little note in here just to say details when it comes to budget creation, details are king. Make sure that the areas for which you are asking for support and those you anticipate reporting on are represented budget. This will inform your data collection later on. And so a lot of times grants get written and it just says, we want to do a food pantry at our church and we would like $5,000, which is a very small grant for a food pantry, but that's what ends up being asked when we don't break down the items of what we think our projected budget will be. So your grantors, your funders, they want to know that you have looked at your expenses, that you've done your research, that you've pieced out where all of these dollars will go, so that that $5,000 or 10 or 15 or 500, whatever is being awarded, it's not going to be used up on unexpected expenses and unanalyzed expenses so soon that the project doesn't actually get to go to get underway because we didn't look at the expenses as a whole. So figuring out your budgets from the very beginning, and that could include travel expenses. If If you're working on a personal project like a book or a thesis or some sort of theological project, you might need traveling expenses to conduct surveys, to visit with other communities or pastors. Maybe you are creating something at your church, a program, and you want to see how other churches are doing that. I cannot emphasize how important that is. Either is if your grantor will grant monies for travel expenses, take advantage of that, so that you can see how other people are doing what you would like to do. Event supplies. This could be all of the supplies for your event, for your program. Contract worker payments. That's, if you've got W-9 employees that will be working with you in any way, whether that's teachers or childcare. Utilities. This might mean utilities for your specific place. You might have to say you're working within your church, but you're wanting to do a program or a project, and you need to account for just the utilities in that space. You can work with your facilities and finance directors to figure out what percentage of that space would require what, so that even though that would go into the overall pool of finances at your church, it would still, you're still wanting to be able to support the water and the bathrooms and the heating and air in the areas that you're going to be using as well. So that often will qualify. Location rental, if that's needed. Supplemental salary. We talked earlier with the question that was asked about salaries for people hired to carry out the grants or the grant projects. This does not have to be, you do not have to have any of that person's salary in your grant. You also can put part of their salary in your grant or all of the salary in your grant. That's up to you. But it can supplement if you want to say that you want to supplement the salary of, we'll go on with the food pantry director position, but that the church will match those funds. Then that's also appealing to foundations, because you're saying we're investing as well. We want to see this continue. We're carving it out in our own budget so that it'll give us some cushion to eventually cover it all when these grant monies are up. But it doesn't have to be, you get to decide which part of that you want to write in. Copies, print, postage. This is an item in budgets that's often left out because you just don't think about it. So things like, if you're going to need to mail something, if you're going to need to make copies of things, if you're going to need to use the internet for sign-in systems for whatever you're doing, that might be something to figure out a percentage of as well. How can, if you're sharing internet with other places in your church, for instance. So grant applications vary widely, and they're all determined by the organization needs and stipulations set forth by the funder. I have written grants that have taken months to collect necessary pieces, including half a year's worth of data, a Secretary of State office's letter of good standing, letters of recommendation, and a detailed calendar on projected events. These have also often come with a strict reporting schedule and hours of time commitment. And so if that feels daunting, let me also say, and I have written grants that ask for a loose budget that can be subject to change as needed, along with a narrative and willingness to send a final report once all the money is spent in a simple email. So 2 things to consider at this point in the process. Once you've found your application, found your good grant match, figured out your punch list and looked at your budget, these are 2 decent questions to ask yourself. is the funding worth the requirements to receive it? If it's going to take 500 hours of your time, but only save your organization $1,300, which is an experience I had personally, it is likely not worth it. And there are likely other avenues that make more sense for your schedule and needs. Are the grants, and number two, are the grant specifics aligned enough with your purpose and your ministry to help move you forward in your mission? To that second point, there may be instances where the program or project that you're pitching would be more highly considered if a certain aspect of your proposal were highlighted more explicitly. And that's something that you'll want to work with a board or other leadership or just wise voices if you're discerning on a personal level to figure out. For instance, maybe you would like to write a grant to fund a community betterment program in your church's neighborhood. And originally this project included after-school childcare and beautification projects such as community murals. However, the specific grant you are writing is being awarded by a funding source that puts high priority on environmental care. They like that you want to do beautification projects and after-school child care, but they also really need for it to have an environmental aspect of it to truly consider what you're pitching. So this is where you must ask yourself if crafting your project's proposal to include such a direction fits with your capabilities, your area's needs, and the general mission of your effort. Maybe you hadn't considered that type of aspect. Maybe it does not fit with your area where you are. Maybe it doesn't fit with your interest. But if it does, maybe in addition to community murals, you also write in a community garden or a few days for leading neighbors in a fruit tree planting experience or a trash pickup opportunity, something that gets it on the radar and puts it in line with the grantor, but doesn't diminish your mission and goal as well. There might have to be some negotiation if it makes sense and allows you and your organization to have integrity in doing so. So this sums that up. Curating your application to better fit a funder's interest is only troublesome when it takes away from the forward movement of your particular mission, which is why it's so important to have that established ahead of time. Curating your application to better fit a funder's interest is only troublesome when it takes away from the forward movement of your particular mission, which is why it is so important to have that mission established ahead of time and to continue to revisit it and have it as a lens as you and anyone else who is writing this grant with you assesses your application before turning it in. All right. Before we take a break and speak to narrative writing, that's what we're going to come back to, I'd like to take some minutes to have, let's see if I can stop my screen sharing. Did I stop it?
Yes.
I'd like to take some minutes to have you share out loud or in the chat what types of personal or organizational projects you are considering at the moment for grant applications. And if you don't have a project in the wings at the moment, what types of projects are you aware of that have been funded by grants that you have witnessed either in your church context or elsewhere?
Hi, Can you hear me? This is Libby.
Hey,
Okay. We started when COVID came around and we had to close down church and we're doing virtual. And when we came back, I'm sorry, my dogs are ridiculous.
that's just part of it.
We wanted to think outside the box, so we were trying to think of new ways to get people to come back to church. So we built a very temporary stage outside of our sanctuary and invited people to come to our 8:30 service and bring their lawn chairs, and the band played. And so we started doing that. We were having really great crowds coming to our outdoor service until it gets too hot, and then we have to come back inside and people stop coming. And then in the fall we do it again. So this is our fourth roundabout of doing outside worship, and our temporary stage is started to sag and fall apart, and we want to rebuild it, make it bigger, put in electrical so it's easier for us to set up every day. So this is a project that we have in mind right now, and we're trying to get some funds for it. I'm really excited about it because everybody really loves to come to outside worship. They can sit as far apart as they want or close together. It's really different. We see our neighbors coming out and like standing on the periphery of the property to watch church. And that's really kind of speaking about next program going on. That's sort of our fingers out in the community. And we're really excited about how this has sort of changed our vision of church. You know, you don't have to be inside four walls to have church. And we've had really great experiences with it. So that's what we're working on. But also in our neighborhood, we live outside of the parish. And so several projects we have had to put on hold because the parish is requiring us to put in a new sign. We have to put in a new sidewalk. That's $35,000. We've had to sideline several projects like that because that's not in the budget. So,
Yeah.
you know, you might want to, when you're writing a grant like that, if you have something outside that's going to, you know, you have to have a permit for, you don't run into things like, oh, you have to put in a sidewalk, because that could totally squash anything you're going for. We don't for this project that we're working on, but you know, we've had several things we just had to shelve because, you know, 35,000 is a lot.
Yeah.
And we even get to use it really because it's on the, you know, by the street.
Right.
Anyway, that's what we're working on. We're excited.
That's a really good point to note for the group too as a whole. Is if you are doing something that's going to require, if you're going to have to ask permission, you probably also want to check in, especially if it's outdoor, with your council person or someone that can indicate what type of permits you might need before you get started. So maybe you could write some of that into a grant so that it could actually make it possible. Thank you for sharing.
I think one of
Anybody else?
the points that Libby makes that I really want to emphasize is when you do your planning and you do your groundwork, look at every possibility, because surprises like that can wreck your project. If you spend all your grant money up front and get your project going, and then somewhere down the line you find this other thing that has to be funded and you don't have the funds for it, you've now spent all this money to do something that you're not going to be able to complete. So I think that's a really good point, Libby. Thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else have a project you want to share or a project idea you want to share with Brittany? We do have one in the chat, Brittany. It says, Emily Carroll says, would like to get LED lights for sustainability of the building, of our building, and looking for a grant for such an endeavor.
Yeah, that's great. And that's, Deborah, I don't know if you would agree with this too, but that something like that you could look for in religious grant settings, faith-based grant settings, or environmental grant settings. You might find one that overlaps, but sometimes you might have to assess your need from a couple of different vantage points to see what grants would be open to you.
Right. And I thought, Brittany, when you were talking about the budget, one of the things I might share is when you're looking for grant opportunities, you may have to piece together grant money to get your entire project completed, because some some RFPs will exclude certain budget categories. Excuse me. So some might not pay for personnel. Some might not pay for bricks and mortar type things. Some might only fund equipment or might not fund equipment. So you have to really read into those restrictions on grants to find out what parts of your project that particular grant can fund.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I will say, in my experience, I have found very few grants that are willing to pay for personnel or operating funds, unless it is personnel for a project that is brand new, and you're needing to carve out a new position of some sort. But if it is operating funds, most places that I have applied to do not want to touch operating funds. So if you can support your operations, your salaries, your utilities through other funding sources, maybe that's where your donations go, maybe that's where your offering goes, then you can shift some of your expenses for actual, outreach. Mission and outreach, we know, is a real big eye catcher for grants for good reason. And that's something to consider if you're having to piece together your funding. The piece that is going to affect the community at large is probably going to be appealing to your grantors. I see wanting to start a music and fine arts community program. I can point you in the direction of Knoll Community Arts Program. They have a fantastic system in place that is running like a well-oiled machine at this point. So I can get you in touch, Nancy. Reading through historical registry. I don't know if I've gotten to that point in the presentation, but there are grants out there for archives and historical endeavors. I think that's one of the ones that I put on the list, Deborah, that you will be sending out. You might can speak to the storm. Renovation money.
Yeah, I think there are some restrictions on conference funds. I can't speak to that directly, but I understand there are restrictions on some of the conference funds for building renovations. So, and we do have quite a number of churches in the conference that have been damaged by multiple storms. And so the funds are just not, I don't think the funds are there to do restoration or repairs on church buildings right now. So that's a place where definitely external funding would be helpful to fund those projects.
I do wonder, did I see Sam Hubbard in this chat? I'm not sure. Sam, if you're there, I'd love to ask. I know that that there might, if there aren't renovation for current building funds there, and even if this doesn't fall within our conference, if it's out, if it's outsourced to different foundations and different funding sources, repurposing buildings is one way to incorporate the repairs that are needed while also maybe expanding the mission. And so maybe you're looking to share your sanctuary with other community groups that are in the area, or maybe you're wanting to turn your downstairs, you're desperately needing Renovation's basement space of Sunday school classes into an arts program. If that's something that you can write into a grant, the restoration of buildings with the repurposing of buildings, that is a way to get that conversation moving when maybe some funding sources don't want to just fund repairs. Any other ideas before we move into a little bit of a break time?
I will say one other thing, Brittany, that you talked about when you were talking about budgets and about finding money. One of the things that the foundation is really going to be interested in when we receive grant proposals is that we want to know, and we want it clearly stated in those proposals, what skin do you have in the game? In other words, if you have a project and you're coming to us to ask for $5,000 or whatever, and your project is $5,000, we're going to want to know, are you putting some funds in this too, or are you asking us to fund the entire thing? I think that's going to give, if we can clearly see that your church is investing in this project too, then we're more likely to fund it. It's more appealing to us if we know you're putting some money into it.
So a few reasons I think it's so important to share, and also, you didn't share in this moment, but you'd like to share in the chat, or you'd like to ask a question about a particular idea, or if someone else in the group has maybe done this before. I'd love to get it out there so that, well, one, I don't want us to fall asleep and we can share our ideas, but also this is how we gain inspiration for our own context and how we identify opportunities for potential collaboration, which makes this a great opportunity, a great time to point out that, like I said earlier, funders love of collaboration can happen among organizations or individuals through a specific grant. So for instance, a few years ago, I wrote a grant for a mosaic community mural, which ended up being facilitated by our arts program located at a local health center and pharmacy, and incorporated the service hours of local elementary kids, elderly people from a few different nonprofits in the area, and after school care facilities. So it was highly appealing to funders that 3 nonprofits would be involved, and ultimately 600 to 1,000 community members would be. So if you can collaborate in your region, conference-wise, with different individuals, if you can collaborate, do collaborate. So I'm going to stop there. This is a good point to take a break and stretch, and let's say take about a 7-minute break. See you back here about 2:06, 3:06.
Thank you, Brittany.
Math. See you in just a few minutes.
I'm trying to listen, but you're recording. I was like, but if somebody asks a question, I can't answer it.
Well, hold on a second.
We have about 1 minute and then we'll get started. Okay, before Brittany goes on with the second half of this presentation, I wanted to give you an update on some things that are happening with the Foundation's Grants Committee and some things that you can be on the lookout for from your Foundation Grants Committee. We met last week actually up at the Wesley Conference Center, and we're in the process of revising some of our grant application processes for 2022. And we're going to roll out those new processes in the second quarter of next year. So beginning in the second quarter, we'll be accepting proposals using our new process. And so that process, while it's still being fine-tuned, is now going to include application forms submitted electronically. We will no longer accept paper application forms. Everything will be electronic. We are also developing a new scorecard against which to judge all proposals as they come in. So we can have a more fair and equitable judging. And we'll make those scorecards available to you so that you can know what kinds of things you're going to lose points on or what kind of things are going to get you brownie points. We are also developing an reporting form, a new reporting form, to help us all a little bit more with accountability. In the grants that we've awarded in the past, we really haven't had any follow-up on how the funds were spent or the impacts that you've had with the funds that you received. So we are going to give that a little boost by developing a new report form, and everyone who receives funds from us, from the foundation, will need to submit a report form on that project before you can be considered for any additional funds. We're also going to make a change in how often we review grants. In the past, we've just been doing them twice a year. Beginning in 2022, we'll be reviewing grants every quarter. So if your grant comes in past the deadline in a quarter, it will be held to the next quarter, but it won't be held for 6 months or 8 months like we have in the past. We also have identified 4 focus areas for grant funding for 2022. And those are going to be equipping for ministry, and that includes both clergy and laity. And yes, we've had conversations, and we are going to continue to fund the nonprofit church leadership program at Dakota Wesleyan University for our clergy who are interested. The second area, focus area, is innovative ministries. And one of the things that we want to be really conscious of here is we want those ministries to be innovative for your church. And so what's going to help you to tell us how that's innovative is for you to really be clear on, Brittany talked about this a little bit earlier, about the need or the justification for the project. How is this going to, why are you in a unique place? What's the need? How's it going to benefit people? So that's what we'll really be looking for in that innovative ministries area. The third area is fostering connections. Brittany touched on this too. Collaborations, getting with other churches in the other area to do a project, or other organizations in your community to do a project, so that you can have a broader impact with the funds that you request. And also the final area is disaster response. You know, the foundation knows we need to stay in the disaster response business because we are in Louisiana and we are gonna have disasters. And so the foundation wants to be able to support however we can. We don't have unlimited funds, but we do want to dedicate some of the funds that we do have available to disaster response. Once we get all the documents finished and the web forms are ready to go, we're planning to do another grants webinar to roll that out and share all that in with you. And so stay tuned for that announcement. And then Kelly, do you have the contact slide that you can share? If you have further questions about United Methodist Foundation grants, you can contact me, or you can contact Tracy at the foundation office, and we'll answer your questions as best we can. And let me see. Tracy's got our contact information on the screen for you, email addresses. So if you have questions, reach out to one of us, but stay tuned for announcements coming in the first quarter of 2022. Okay, Brittany, back to you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's get this screen shared one more time. All right. Let's talk for a minute about narratives. Almost every grant I've ever written or awarded has included a narrative. This is typically a 1 to 5 page written essay inviting funders into a better understanding of who you or your organization or congregation are, what you know, what research and organizing work you've done up to this point, and how you believe this will benefit the common good should you be awarded the money. Deborah, can you speak to whether or not the foundation grants typically ask for narratives?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Yes, they do. And in the new application form, those areas of where we're looking for narrative description will be defined in the web form.
Fantastic, thank you. So a typical template to follow when writing a narrative looks like this, and I'm going to show you a template that I have followed. If you search grant narrative template, you will find a plethora. There's no one way to do it. And as Deborah alluded to, many grants might say exactly what they need in that narrative format, but if they leave it open-ended, this is typically a decent template to follow. So that includes a project summary. This is 1 to 2 sentences, also known as the elevator pitch. If you get into an elevator and someone asked you about your project, what would you tell them before your ride is done? This can start with a stat from a study or a quote from a scholar or a well-known voice. That's a good way to open it up. And it said something like, this Pew Research study shows this, and it sort of introduces you to the problem that we are addressing with this grant, or the area that we're getting into with the rest of it. Project scope, so that's project summary, and then project scope. This is the meat of it. It's 1 to 2 pages typically, to include the need, activities, and deliverables. It's good to include some personalized testimonies or quotes here at this point too. So that goes back to, if this is a project that's already underway, gathering some testimonies reflecting on how it has served certain groups of people, or if it is one that is being projected, testimonies from people saying this is something that we know that we need and are looking forward to as well. Then you've got the project personnel and schedule. This is 2 to 3 paragraphs. That is where you flesh out who is going to be involved, who is directing, who's assisting, and what the schedule looks like, so that, again, your grantors know that the money won't be given and that you're just kind of winging it until reporting season. That you have already in your calendar of the markers that you want to hit. And then your numbers. So different grants will ask for this in different ways. This is your budget in paragraph form if it's not specified as an itemized form, if might be requested later. But if there is no request for an itemized outlined budget in the narrative, then you at least want to take a little bit of time to talk about your numbers and to say what might not get put in an Excel sheet, to give it a little more context. And then your projected effects. This is you wrapping up your narrative, 1 to 2 paragraphs summarizing your anticipated impact. How do you expect this to go? What can we look back on? Can we pull these last 2 paragraphs at the end of the grant period and reflect to see, did we meet our marker? And a lot of times you will use these last 2 paragraphs in your reporting, or you may use it in your writing for a second grant or a third grant. We outlined this when we wrote our first grant. This is how it actually ended up, and this is what we adjusted or not adjusted for this next grant. So everything builds on everything else in grant writing. Very little information and detail gathering and narrative compiling is going to be in vain. You will use it likely, whether that is in the actual grant, in the reporting, or in your reflection for grants to come. So again, there are countless narrative examples online, not just templates, but you can read through examples, whether that's 1 page, 5 pages, to give you kind of an outline and an understanding of what your funders may be looking for. And if you are applying for an annual grant or multiple grants that are similar, let me say this very specifically, you do not have to have a completely new narrative for them, but you will need to shift your language and not just copy and paste. No funder, no grantor wants just a copy and pasted narrative. They want to know that you have considered the new year, the new projects, their specific organization or foundation, and the ins and outs of what they offer. But you can pull from some of that narrative and edit around it to curate it for a different year or a different funder. But you do not have to reinvent the wheel every time. So the narrative is similar to the reporting in that this is your opportunity to infuse some humanity into the process, into a process that can easily become sterile. And I say this as someone who loves grants, loves the grant writing process. It can sometimes feel all about numbers, all about boxes being checked off. But for many of us are actually the end rather the means to an end, and I would say probably most of us here, and they should be. So grants are the vehicles that help carry out the projects and the passions that we have in the world. They are the resource that enables the story. So any opportunity you have to tell that story, do. This is one of them. The narrative is one of the chances that you have to tell the story of your project, and reporting is another. So when it comes to reporting on a grant, similar to how each grant has a different application process and requirements, every grant will vary in what it expects regarding reporting. However, most will ask for something once the funds have been spent, even if that's just to say, send us an email when you've spent all your money so that we know. This might look like a simple email that confirms the projected budget was indeed how dollars were spent. It may look like a 5 seats, a breakdown of attendance, another narrative explaining, sure, before you apply that you, if at all possible, make sure that you are aware of what is expected of you and whether or not that fits with your needs and capabilities regarding the reporting. Definitely in my experience, governmental-based grants require a lot of reporting. Some foundations do, other foundations do not. But to report well, regardless of expectations, these are some good rules of thumb. Number one is create a data system. Data equals dollars. Even if the numbers aren't expected for your current grant funders, there may come a time when they are needed for another application, and you'll have already had it organized and gathered by creating a data collecting system. So utilize Google Docs, utilize Excel, have people sign in or counted at your events. Keep it in a notes app on your phone. Keep up with attendance, keep up with expenses, keep up with financial tracking, take pictures of your receipts, revisit these things at the end of the month so that you don't have to spend so much time on it in the end. Again, there is not one way to, or one data system, but it would be good. It's a good rule of thumb to at least have one in place. And your grant, your funder may say, we want XYZ at the end, and that might inform your data collecting system as well. Number two, make your reports personalized. Send pictures. Again, this is your chance to tell the story. Send thank you notes. Add your funders and your foundations to your website or your brochures. Have the kids or the clients who are recipients of that specific event sign a thank you card. Gather testimonies. Those who run the grant programs are not robots. Are you a robot, Deborah? No. She says no. They likely do what they do because they want to see goodness multiplied in the world. They likely care far more, if not just as much, about knowing that your pottery program became a safe haven for those navigating divorce or a diagnosis, or they are about knowing how many hours you served, how many people. So the story matters most, And you can tell that in your narrative, you can tell that in your reporting. And on that note, number 3 is report more often than is required. Now, this is just from personal experience. Your foundation people may say, please do not send us mail that we do not ask for. But what I have found is that it's a nice gesture that if a grantor asks you to send a final report at the end of the year, you consider sending a quarterly report of some sort. Even if that's a thank you card, as we mentioned above, a collage of pictures, an invitation to an upcoming event. These grants don't have to have stark boundaries around them. Your people who support you financially can also be invited to a donors banquet or a concert, a Christmas concert, or the like, just to be an extra way of saying you're on our mind, we're grateful, and we're continuing to move along in the work that we told you we were going to do.
Brittany, I'd like to add something to
Yeah,
that on
please.
behalf of the Foundation Grants Committee. Your stories about how you use the money and about the impacts that you've had helps us as a foundation to go to other donors who give money to the foundation. So it's kind of like a circle. So if you get money from the foundation and you can help us tell the story better to our funders, then we then can have more money to help fund more projects. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is for you to tell the story with pictures, with quotes, so that we can share that with our donors.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yes, it is not a one-stop. It does not stop there. It keeps going so that we can keep going. All right, now before we move on to a question and answer time, I have moved us fast today. I want to make sure we cover some basic rules of thumb for grant proposals. And some of these can be found in the book I mentioned earlier, John Riddle's Managing Nonprofits, while some I have added. And they are, as you'll see, do not ask for more than you need. So even if a grant says we offer from 500 to 50,000, if you need 13,000, don't ask for 50. Unless you have that projected and written. Again, this is why an itemized budget is so important, for you to know exactly what you need, for your grantors to know that you know exactly what you need, and that you're not asking for more than that for this particular time, so that there is more to go around. Take your time writing the proposal. As someone who has waited to the very last minute, I can say that is not a good idea. So if you have a chance, if you've looked at your applications and you have seen that there is a deadline and you are, put it in your calendar, know when it's going to be. I missed the deadline last week. And because I didn't write it in my calendar, I didn't even look for it when I first opened the grant. So when you are searching for grants, put those deadlines in your calendar. Put yourself a reminder a month ahead of time that the grant is due in a month. Mainly because even if you are a fast worker, not all the people who have all of the pieces you will need for the grant are going to be as fast as you. And so you may work well under pressure, but you might need a very big piece from your finance director or from your board, or you name it. You may need to gather a lot of things that, and again, if it's a paper grant that needs to be mailed in, then that will be something to consider too. Number 3, never lie. It's just no need to, but we can just name it. Never use the exact same proposal twice. So this goes back to you can pull from content. You can pull from narratives, you can pull quotes and stats and things like that, but make sure that you are at least curating it some for that specific owner and your specific project. Be upfront about asking for money is number 5, and number 6 is don't waste time getting to the point. If you are filling out a grant, we all know what you're filling out the grant for. We know that the money is the ask, and it doesn't have to be cushioned or introduced with a lot of fluff. We can just get to the point and not waste your time or the reader's time or the board's time getting there. Do not use grant funds for anything other than what was written in the proposal and agreed upon by grantors. This is a huge point for me as someone who has seen grant funds misused and misplaced, and I know from working with different nonprofits that there comes a time when there are temptations to reallocate funding that has been specified for a specific project, especially if you have some of the more pressing items like salaries, like utilities that need those dollars. If a grant has been specified for a specific project, do not use that money for other projects. If for some reason you get into a bind and you need to reach out to your grantor to discuss, then that's one thing. But the main rule of thumb is grant money goes for what grants were written for. Contact funders with questions about amendments. So as I mentioned, I wrote a grant once that had very, very much a strict budget. What it was written for needed to be how it was spent. I wrote another grant once that had a loose budget and said between the funder and the grant writer, there was an understanding that if amendments needed to happen, then they would be submitted to the board and approved or denied, and that would be the exchange. So that's all usually up front, a possibility. If that is a possibility, then contact your funders with any amendments that may be open to you. Collect more data than you think you need and prioritize the story. So we've spoken a little more to that, but I would say if you're going to pull anything from that list to take away today, if you can remember anything, I would say it would be use your dollars for what was agreed upon, collect more data than you think you need, and prioritize the story. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because those are the slides that I have. For us today, and open it up, kick it back over to Deborah, and we can open it up for any more questions that we've got.
Does anybody have any other questions for Britney? Or for me, or Tracy's on the call too. So if you have other questions for the foundation or for Britney, we'll be happy to take those at this time. Okay, if there are no questions, I do want to thank you for participating in the webinar today. We hope that this has been helpful, and hope that it sparked some ideas in you about maybe directions you need to go or want to go. And as I said earlier, we're going to be emailing the webinar recording to all participants, as well as all the resources that Britney mentioned today and her PowerPoint. Kelly, if you'll put up that contact information one more time for Tracy and I, so that if people have questions, they can reach out to us via email, and we will get back with you on that as soon as we can. I do want to let you know too that the foundation has additional webinars coming up On November 3rd, there will be the communication strategies for churches. Todd Rossnagel is going to be doing that one, the good, the bad, and the ugly, what we've learned during the pandemic. On November 4th, communicating in the future, what the next decade might look like in church communication with Todd Rossnagel again. And then on November 10th, we'll be doing taking care of business, which is a roadmap for those who will someday take care of you. And that's going to be presented by Phyllis McLaurin, and that one is hosted by the foundation. Phyllis is going to discuss the importance of creating that roadmap for our loved ones on how to take care of your personal business when we're no longer able to do that for ourselves. The web address for registering for these webinars is on the slide on the far right corner, or you can just scan that QR code if you'd like and get yourself registered for the events. One last call for questions. Any other questions? Okay, then. Well, Brittany, oh, go ahead, Peggy. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Do you think you will have the changes in the forms done before the new year, or is this a January 2022 type of opening situation?
We are hoping to have all the forms and everything ready for the first quarter, so in January, but we will not implement until the second quarter. So if you have a proposal that's going to come in for the first quarter, it's coming in under our old guidelines. So the new stuff won't roll out until we won't start judging those applications until the second quarter with the new format. Any other questions?
Well, thanks for sharing the information. I'm Liberta Jameson Myers of Shreveport, Louisiana, with St. Paul United Methodist Church. The information was very well presented, and we look forward to receiving additional information because we tried to serve the youngsters and at J.S. Clark Elementary School. We do reading as fundamental there, and we really could we need to purchase additional books to give to the youngsters. These are youngsters from low-income families, and we've tried to serve them. We also do essay and spelling bee contests with them. We try to encourage them to learn how to write, and then we have them to do the essays verbally so that you can learn to speak before an audience. So thanks again for the information.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
So glad to know you're in Shreveport too.
Yes. Oh, I remember I see a lot of names of people that I know from the years past.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Well, Brittany, thank you so much. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us on this very important topic, and one that's critical to all churches right now and lots of organizations. We appreciate it, and y'all be safe out there. It is storming here now. I've gotten about 3 tornado alerts while we were sitting here. So y'all stay safe.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everybody.
You.
Thank you, Brittany.
Bye-bye.